Brethren, the Story of a Great Recovery. Part 1, England and Wales. Chapter 29. Cheltenham Assembly. There appears to be no written record of the exact date when the assembly at Cheltenham came into being. For some time in the late 70s of last century, a little company of believers was meeting in the old Corn Exchange, now a cinema house, where they sought to remember the Lord on the first day of the week. Regent Hall, the present meeting place, was opened on Lord's Day, April 23, 1882, with an early morning prayer meeting at which 40 persons were present. The circumstances which led to the commencement of the assembly have not been handed down, but among those whose names are still remembered for their labor in the gospel and the shepherding of the flock is A. J. Cummings. He was a prominent businessman in the town, and it was mainly through his efforts and influence that such stalwarts of those days as Robert Chapman, Henry Dyer, General Mackenzie, George Muller, Hudson Taylor, Thomas Newberry and Shootham Henry were to be found on occasions ministering to the spiritual needs of the assembly. Thus the meeting was cared for and built up in a very real and practical way. Its proximity to Leominster, where an important conference for believers was held annually, drew many of the chief men to the assembly, and when those memorable gatherings ceased to be held, the interest was transferred to Cheltenham, which then became the conference centre. The gatherings have continued from year to year, the meetings being held on the first Wednesday in October. Besides the annual conference for ministry, a missionary conference has been held in the spring of each year, this being the outcome of missionary interest, particularly among the young people. This evidence of spiritual life has not ceased to manifest itself, which, in a measure, is revealed, in that during recent years Cheltenham Assembly has commended 3 laborers for work in the foreign field: Dennis Mills, who went to China; Miss Hill, now working in the West Indies; and H. G. Young, for service in Algeria. Half a century ago Cheltenham was noted as a place where the gospel might at any time be heard faithfully preached from many of the church pulpits in the town, though of late years evangelical energy and zeal have been on the wane. In the early years of the Assembly's testimony, a number of young men were saved under the ministry of a godly Church of England clergyman. When he left the town, his successor, not being of an evangelical turn, sought to divert the activities of the young men into other channels, which led them to look around for a more congenial spiritual home where their energies would be more profitably utilized in the Master's service. They were brought into touch with Mr. Cummings and were eventually received into fellowship. This infusion of young life was a decided stimulus to the assembly, and its influence in the town may be dated from that time and circumstance. It is interesting to observe that a granddaughter of the godly clergyman referred to is at the present time a member of the Cheltenham Assembly. The fact that her father was also filling the position of a clergyman in the town did not deter his daughter from following the dictates of her spiritual desires in taking her place with fellow believers around the Lord's table. In later years, among those who helped in the edification of believers by gracious ministry were Colonel Molesworth, Dr. Oles, and Mr. Stuart Henderson. Visitors to Cheltenham Cemetery are shown what has come to be known as the Plymouth Brethren plot, where the graves of exclusive and open brethren lie side by side awaiting the resurrection morn. Among them is the resting place of Charles Henry Mackintosh, whose familiar initials appended to brethren literature are known the world over. He was born in 1820 at Glenmalure Barracks, County Wicklow, Ireland, where his father, who was a captain in a Highland regiment, was stationed during the rebellion. Converted at the age of 18 through the tender letters of a sister, followed by a prayerful perusal of J. N. Darby's Operations of the Spirit. He early gave himself to the study of the Scriptures. At the age of 24 he opened a school at Westport, but fearing the pursuit of this vocation would altogether absorb his passionate interest in spiritual matters, he afterwards abandoned all thoughts of pursuing a scholastic profession, devoting his time and pen to expository work. His 6 volumes, containing copious notes on the books of the Pentateuch, which have passed through several editions, still occupy a readily accessible position on the Bible student's bookshelf. As a platform speaker, CUHM was much sought after, and during the revival of 1859-60, when Ireland came under a great spiritual awakening, he took a prominent part in the activities of the gospel. It is as a writer rather than as a speaker that his name is remembered today, and in this connection it would be difficult to estimate the powerful influence of the pen of CEHM during the last 50 years. The closing years of a useful life were spent at Cheltenham, and though he now very rarely appeared on the platform through ill health and advancing years, still his pen was not idle, and when towards the end of 1896 he was called home, his last manuscript, The God of Peace, was in the hands of the publishers. Though Mr. Mackintosh remained with the exclusive brethren to the end, his sympathies were not confined to that particular circle of believers, and he was ever ready to give expression of his unfeigned love to all brethren. The gathering at Pound House, Street, Austell. A little over 50 years ago there gathered together a number of believers in what was known as Pound House in the high street of the village of St. Austell in Cornwall. For some time previous to this, there appears to have been a sincere exercise of soul and a spirit of inquiry as to the true interpretation of several New Testament passages which had engaged their attention. Amongst those who came together was Edward Fetter, a man of keen spiritual discernment. He it was whom the Holy Spirit used in revealing to them through the Scriptures what was the will of God concerning the things which appeared to disturb their spiritual peace. The result was the sweeping aside of the irksome bondage of ecclesiastical formalities, for the simple gathering to the name of the Lord, in implicit obedience to Him whom they sought to remember in the breaking of bread. The meeting went on in happy fellowship and with signs of blessing for a number of years, until their testimony was assailed from without by the arch-enemy, brought about by a circumstance emanating from an assembly 100 miles distant, which had no real bearing upon that particular church. This, unhappily, had the effect of sowing discord, and the testimony of the assembly suffered in consequence. Nevertheless, there were those who, despite the severe trial and diminished numbers, remained faithful to the trust committed to them. These brethren, therefore, decided to continue in a simple way to remember the Lord on the first day of the week, the meeting being held in the drawing room of a dwelling house in the little village of Charlestown, a few miles distant. In later years the assembly gathered in the home of George Wood, at Slades, St. Austell. Early in the year 1924, when the increase in numbers and the evidence of spiritual growth was felt in their midst, the brethren who had the care of the assembly became exercised as to the need of a suitable hall and a more open testimony. By this time a Sunday school had been formed and gospel meetings commenced, so that by the following year the Seymour Gospel Hall was opened. The last gospel meeting held in the home of Mr. Wood was attended by 33 people, and the gospel was preached by R. N. Gelder, of Westcliff-on-Sea. Following upon the vicissitudes through which the assembly has passed, it is pleasing to observe that since the opening of the hall the testimony has been wonderfully maintained, several having been baptized and added to the church.